For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Paul Holden and Hennie van Vuuren join me in studio today to discuss their latest book, The Devil in the Detail, How the Arms Deal Changed Everything. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Your book, The Devil in the Detail, How the Arms Deal Changed Everything, takes the reader on a journey of insight. What inspired you to write the book, and what do you hope readers will achieve through its reading?
I think there were two main reasons why we decided to write it. The first is that the arms deal remains such a central part of our political landscape. And while other books have addressed it, we felt that there was additional detail to go into to keep it on top of the agenda, to make sure people are still following the matter, which is even more important now with the Commission of Inquiry happening. The second reason, I'll go back a little bit to explain it, but I wrote a book called The Arms Deal in Your Pocket a couple of years ago, which was a simple basic guide to the arms deal. And the idea behind that was to use only publicly accessible material to tell the story of the arms deal, and to make the point that all the publicly accessible material suggests there should be a commission of inquiry. But once I'd finished that, I had the fortune of meeting Hennie, and we decided to look a little bit deeper and start using documents that weren't in the public realm. And I started a 3-year process of investigation. We initially intended only to do a couple of very short papers, but the amount of information that we uncovered suggested a book length would probably be the best way to do it. So it was really an attempt to shoehorn in all the new information that we got, all the new documents that we got hold of, all the new people who were willing to speak to us.
Now, do you think that reopening the investigation into the arms deal will have any positive effects on the country? And where do you think this will leave South Africa's leaders?
I think for us, from the Institute for Security Studies side, we were keen to work together on this project precisely because we believe that there needs to be an open process that meaningfully contributes to South Africans' understanding of the corruption, the abuse of power, the wasted resources that have marked the arms deal in so many ways for more than a decade. And I think we do believe that the Commission of Inquiry that President Jacob Zuma has announced provides us with a real opportunity to dig deep down into the origins of the arms deal, the impact, the offsets, so many aspects. We've argued that there's one, I think Paul and I have argued there's one aspect that isn't covered, which remained the previous investigations. Not to forget, huge amount of resources have been spent over the past decade on repeated occasions within Parliament, involving other investigative agencies, the Scorpions and others, who all attempted to investigate aspects of the arms deal and so often faltered because of political interference, because politicians lied in Parliament. And I think we do need some answers to those questions. But overall, given the impact of the arms deal, given the way in which it's meant that it's undermined, I think, many of our institutions, the opening of investigations again afresh, the process itself, and of course the new information that's contained in this book, we hope will lead to an informed public being able to influence that process and avoid an arms deal of this nature, or corruption of this nature, seeping into large public procurement projects in future again.
Now, you say that the arms deal was not only economically irrational, but virtually suicidal, almost single-handedly derailing the post-apartheid economic project. Can you elaborate on that statement?
Sure. I think that there's a couple of elements to that statement. The first is you have to look at the arms deal in context of when it happened, which was 1999, although it was initiated in 1997. GEAR, which was the macroeconomic policy at the time, had just been implemented. And while its projections were very optimistic, the reality was somewhat different. By 1999, South Africa had been undergoing quite a remarkable economic contraction. Unemployment was at its highest point since the 1980s. And GEAR had some very specific recommendations, one of which was to reduce the fiscal deficit, which a lot of people at the time criticized because it limited the way the state could ameliorate some of the effects of unemployment and poverty. And it was a very narrow band of 3% that they set themselves, which could be spent in deficit on social matters. But the arms deal itself was actually an enormous economic undertaking. It was the single largest post-apartheid acquisition at the time. It's now been eclipsed by the Eskom recapitalization process. It was announced at the time it was 30 billion rand, but now we worked out it's probably around 71 billion rand, all of which is import-heavy, high technology, not very labor-intensive in South Africa. What we uncover in the book is that the shameful thing, I think, is that I think the state knew ahead of time that this was going to have an impact on the economy. There was a report called the Affordability Report, which was drawn up by the Department of Finance and the Department of Trade and Industry, which assessed the macroeconomic impact of the arms deal. And that was presented to Cabinet in August 1999, a couple of months before the final contracts were signed. And the Affordability Report makes it incredibly clear. There were major risks to the economy. According to their worst case scenario, if interest rates were increased on the announcement of the arms deal, and the very important, the offsets which were promised didn't come to fruition, which I argue they haven't, worst case scenario is that 100,000 jobs would be lost. We subsequently decided to recalculate those figures because the affordability report was done on the understanding that the arms deal only cost 25 billion rand. Now we know that it's roughly 3 times that amount. And we were quite horrified to find out what the actual figures came out to be. In our worst case scenario, if interest rates increased on the back of the arms deal and offsets weren't fulfilled, you're looking at 1 million jobs lost, which is roughly 4% of the working population of South Africa. It could have increased unemployment throughout the country by 4%. Not only that, but because it was such a large-scale foreign acquisition, it had a major impact on the budget deficit. According to the own projections of the state, they were looking at least a 1% increase in the budget deficit. Our suggestion suggests it could be considerably more than that. If you consider there was only a 3% leeway, you have 33% of the government's wiggle room, in a sense, being absorbed by this incredibly unpopular arms deal. Unfortunately, we don't have the greatest detail as to the actual impact of the arms deal because we can only use modeling techniques. But my argument is that the amount of money that was spent on the arms deal, its import-heavy nature, the fact that it diverted money from far more productive enterprises. We calculated that if you spent the money on employing maintenance workers, for example, you could create upwards of 100,000 jobs a year, if not more. All those impacts, I think, have a major negative impact on the economy of South Africa and has really dragged it down. And I think back to the 2000s when there was a great deal of optimism about the economy, how rapidly it was growing, how much better it could have done and how much more people could have been employed, how unemployment could have been reduced if the arms deal hadn't happened.
I think that while the book goes into a great amount of detail, as Paul has said, we also uncover some of the secrets that have been locked up for a very long time. For example, the book reveals the fact that in the helicopter part of this package of weapons that we bought, the helicopter deal, there too was corruption, and this hadn't been made public to date. The affordability reports, which we've quoted from, which have been kept secret to date, which point towards the fact of massive job losses that this country suffered. When we look at other aspects, for example, offsets, and look at the conflicts of interest there, the impact on the environment in places like Sabi, where some of those offsets have clearly failed and local people have suffered as a result, all point towards the fact that the arms deal, I think, has had a profoundly negative impact on the majority of this country's people. It's made a small group of foreign companies extremely rich and a very small group of well-connected business people and South African companies equally wealthy off the back, I think, of the rump of this country's population. And again points towards the fact that there are so many secrets that remain hidden in our society, locked up. And an attempt, for example, to put in place the secrecy bill represents an attempt to stop the flow of this kind of information. And I think that's why we urge people to read books like this, other pieces of investigative journalism, information that's been produced by community activists and others, and engage with it, precisely because we must own this type of information and keep these spaces open so that we can better understand our society.
Do you believe that most of the corruption in South Africa stemmed from the arms deal?
I think we argue in the book that the arms deal has been an incredibly important point in our history as a free nation. And it was a turning point to some extent of what we had envisaged and hoped for a new democratic, free South Africa, because it represents the way in which business and politics found themselves in a corrupting relationship that's had a destructive impact on democratic accountability, a culture of democratic accountability, on transparency, on openness. But equally, it's only symptomatic as well of a culture that stems hundreds of years in this country. And I think we often tend to forget that. The insidious nature not only of the way in which apartheid systematically undermined the rights of the majority of South Africans, but equally that there were criminals who further abused the criminal system to steal from the public even further. And it's some of those individuals who were linked to apartheid-era corruption, or certainly were part of that system, who then developed a relationship with individuals in the liberation movement. And we must stress this is not the entire liberation movement, but some individuals who were also part of criminal networks. And therein lies the seed of this arms deal. And I think we've really stressed the fact that this is not something that started on the 27th of April 1994, but stretches much further back. And so many of the answers to our current problems lie quite clearly in problems that preceded 1994. But very clearly the arms deal was a turning point in what we aspire to as a nation, and therefore does deserve the attention that we and other organizations, I think, have tried to give to it over the past few years.
I think I'd add, what facilitates, there are a number of reasons why corruption happens. One of the most fundamental is opportunity and a lack of punishment. And what we've seen is the arms deal has set a model for what happens to people when they're found guilty of corruption. 2 people from the arms deal have been found guilty of misdeed related to the arms deal, and they spent a combined total of 2.5 years in prison, which doesn't exactly send a message that if you abuse the state, you'll pay. The reality is that the way in which the institutions were manhandled around the arms deal, the way in which Parliament was brought in line by the ANC executive, the way in which the Scorpions was essentially shut down as a result of the arms deal, the way in which a whole range of independent institutions within the state which are supposed to monitor expenditure and the fair use of the public purse were marginalized, brought into political line, all happened as a result of the arms deal. And I would argue that the corruption that flows after that point has been in part facilitated by the neutering of those bodies and the reworking of the criminal justice system as a result of the arms deal.
Why do you think the investigation into the arms deal failed?
I think there are a number of reasons. We actually go into quite a bit of detail in the book about the various ways in which investigations have been manhandled and manipulated and undermined. I think it's very clear that the investigation failed because of political interference. The most obvious example of that is the Joint Investigation Report, which was put together which was published in November 2001. Subsequent to that, Richard Young from C² I² was able to access draft versions of the Auditor General's report. And what those very clearly show is that the initial investigation into the arms deal was actually very thorough, and there was a huge amount of information that came out. The initial report was about 650, 700 pages long. Unfortunately, right before it was about to be published, it was distributed to various members of the executive, including the cabinet subcommittee that oversaw the arms deal, and 350 pages disappeared. The joint investigation report that remains is an incredibly interesting document because it's highly contradictory. Most of it says this arms deal is rotten, and then the conclusion says we found no evidence of impropriety. Then the criminal prosecutions that flow from that, I think that there was a huge amount of political contestation that pushed back on it. There was a lot of anger, I think, within certain camps that people were prosecuted selectively. I would argue, and I'll be very honest here, we're talking about Jacob Zuma. I would argue that the prosecution of Jacob Zuma was a fair and justifiable act based on the evidence that had been presented in the Shibia Sheikh trial, even though he'd obviously disagree with that. But there was a degree of political space that was opened up because he was one of the only people who was pursued, when there were a range of other people on whom there were tons of evidence and nothing happened. And that, I think, is a result of political interference right from the top. And that's what's undermined these investigations.
And then finally, how does South Africa move forward from here?
Well, I think the Commission of Inquiry presents us all with a great opportunity to be able to move forward. I think we must ensure that the executive doesn't interfere in this process. The process of a fair, open commission that the public and the media have access to is crucial. The ability of the commission to be able to, the capacity to undertake investigations are things that we need to be monitoring. And when I say we, I think it really is the South African people that need to be monitoring this. This isn't just a judicial process that takes place in a closed room somewhere, but something that should involve all of us. I think we argue quite clearly that the arms deal isn't something, again, that should be left to a small group of journalists, researchers and others to discuss. It's a story of our nation. It's a sin that's happened in our house, and I think that we all have a responsibility to ensure that there is a clearing of the house, that those corrupt elites within government and business who are connected to the arms deal and have other networks throughout the economy now, there is an opportunity here to disrupt them, to ensure that we put a stop to this type of insidious corruption, which so much of it stemmed clearly from apartheid, but also from the arms deal. And I think that it is therefore crucial that we all play a role in monitoring the process that moves ahead. And of course, the message to the business community and others is that we must play a much more active role in countering corruption, in naming it where we see it and not allowing it to become common practice.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for coming to see us in the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Paul Holden and Hennie van Vuuren discussing their new book, The Devil in the Detail.